Let's look at this ancient phrase that clergy and churches have been throwing around for centuries. The kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God, and still another translation, the empire of God. Jesus lived during the pinnacle of power held by the Roman Empire. His home, Galilee in Judah, was occupied by Rome, and on the throne was Herod, a puppet king who took orders from Rome. At the top was Caesar, who was in that culture considered to be God. Caesar was a god, and therefore most of the Caesars also have their own virgin birth stories. All right? It was a way of affirming in the culture that this person at the top of the heap was much more than human. He was God. So, message was clear. You didn't mess with Rome. It was like any other empire. It held on to power with a vengeance and did not tolerate competition. In this context, Jesus, a teacher, was trying to reform Judaism's understanding of God. And that is always a hard thing. Once people lock in an image of God, it's pretty hard to have a conversation with them. But he could see that their belief in God, or a God who would someday return a Jewish king to the throne, a king who would reign with justice and peace, well, that wasn't going to happen any day soon. And so what? You live out your faith perspective waiting for God. Well, if that was your understanding of God, someone who was going to take on the top dog in Rome, you were going to be waiting a long time. And so Jesus did his best to provide an alternative image of God. Everyone knew what the empire of Caesar was like. Jesus invited them to consider what the empire of God was like. But that was really hard. And I think it's almost like his use of language backfired on him. Because really, as soon as we hear the word empire, where do we go? Buckingham Palace, the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, the White House in Washington. And then suddenly we've got God lined up beside all the kings and queens throughout history, except just a little higher on the totem pole. And that has been the image of God translated by our tradition forever. And that image, that worldview, that cosmology is reflected in our hymns. There is this hierarchy of power, and God is at the top of the pecking order. But when you look at Jesus' parables, he's saying anything but that. The reign of God, he said, is like a mustard seed. It is the smallest of seeds, and in fact, it's a weed. Just as an aside, when we had the farm, some mustard kind of popped itself up very slowly and steadily on our front field. We thought it was lovely. It's yellow. But Walter, my dad, who'd grown up on a field, boy, as soon as he saw that, he was out there in a flash. It was a weed. What does that say that Jesus is comparing the kingdom of God to a weed? Anyway, it grows and it grows until it's big enough for a bird to build a nest in it. Wow. What a very different understanding than that big, bad God who went up against the Egyptian Pharaoh in order to liberate the people of Israel from slavery. And it was that God, that big, out there, powerful God, that Jesus was calling into question. He could see that their image of God was based on that, well, whose God is bigger and badder mentality. Well, I mean, it was a no-brainer. In the big and bad category, Caesar won, hands down. But what Jesus was trying to tell people in their parables was, you've got to take God out of that equation. You're never going to understand how God is present, Jesus said, unless you change the way you think about God. Get God out of that pecking order. Think of God as spirit among us that shows up every time someone refuses to take revenge on another person. Every time someone puts the needs of a stranger or a friend ahead of her own. Every time we love our enemy. Every time we use the gifts that we have been given to make the world a better place for everyone. God's kingdom, Jesus is trying to communicate, is not like other political or economic powers. And so when Jesus looked for a way of talking about that, he chose this very lowly but generous mustard seed. Nothing to it, but enough to make a home for a bird. As he would continue to preach without parables at another time, he tried to communicate that greatness, we want our God to be bigger than the other gods, that greatness is not determined by power, but by service. The least among you, he say, you'll be the greatest. Wow. Messes with your head, doesn't it? So look, I think this is good news. That greatness in God's household. Let's use the word household instead of reign, okay? Greatness in God's household is determined by service, not by power. Now we know, and it wasn't too long ago, there was a day, there were centuries of days actually, when the church was big on power. Not always big on service. Well, now we have no power. It's a bit of a drag. It's hard to balance the budget when you don't have any power. Hard to pay the bills. Some churches can't even afford ministers, or to fix their roofs, or to hold on to their manses. We kind of all had a pretty cushy kingdom at one point. But it didn't always translate, did it, into the presence of the unseen God. I'd like to think that in this scheme, St. Andrew's is pulling its weight, shall we say, in making known the unseen life of God. Serving others, making room for diversity, welcoming everyone to the table. That is mustard seed ministry, he would say. Nothing big or flashy, just tiny and persistent. And each of us is called to practice mustard seed ministry as well in the decisions of every moment of every day to act out of our better selves, to act with kindness and grace and forgiveness without judgment, in welcoming the stranger, being generous with the poor, in those very human activities. The reign of God is present. For now. For now. I want you to spend some time thinking about this quote by Desmond Tutu. Today, within the Christian tradition, is All Saints' Day, and it's the day when we recall all of those who have gone before us. We recall loved ones who, within the context of the Christian year, are said to, on this particular day, be a little closer to us than during the rest of the year. I'll say more about that later. But you think about people like Desmond Tutu, like Mother Teresa, like Martin Luther King Jr., like Dorothy Day, all of these people who had in front of them the empire that was powerful and not always just and very often not kind. Yet they, in acts relatively small, were persistent in finding ways to make God's vision of a healthy, inclusive community possible. Certainly, Desmond Tutu is among one of those saints who, one foot in front of the other, made God present in South Africa in the midst of an empire who was loath for him to do so. But look at where we are. Who ever thought that we would see the fall of apartheid in our day? Mustard seed ministry.